soon, and it's time to get down to business. You've heard a little bit about me, but now I want to know a little bit more about all of you. Unfortunately, we don't get to meet in person, and so this is kind of the next best thing to me being able to ask you questions. So some of the organizers, I hope, mentioned that we are going to be using Poll Everywhere today throughout the talk. If you are using your computer or your desktop, I'd ask that you please now open up a browser and enter kind of these credentials down here below. If you prefer to use it on the app, go ahead and open up the app and you can enter Cylita Guy 525. And we are going to see if we can get this to work. So first question, nice, simple one. How is everyone feeling today? Okay. Great. Somebody's feeling meh. I'm sorry about that. That's okay. I'm just going to skip back a slide here for a second so that I can turn on captions. Here we go. Okay, so most folks are feeling good. Great, that's what I like to hear. All right, now I kind of want to know, ComSciCon brings together a lot of different graduate researchers in different areas. So in 1 or 2 words, what do you study? So we've got psychology, biology, some folks studying cancer, ooh, neuroscience, gut brain interactions. I love it. Education, astrophysics. It looks like maybe we have a lot of chemistry and cancer folks. I see Bat up there. That's what I like to see. Fish. Amazing. So it looks like we've got a really diverse group of graduate students here, which is always, it's one of my favorite things about ComSciCon. We spend a lot of time interacting with researchers in our field, and it's always really nice to get to meet other people. That's one of my favorite things about this event. All right. And why are you attending ComSciCon today? So this is an open-ended answer. You should be able to type in a longer answer if you want. What are you hoping to learn? Okay, what are you hoping to gain from this experience? Why did you decide to come? To better your SciComm skills. I like it. To get inspired. Okay. Networking. Oh, we're going to talk about the importance of networking today for sure. Increase social media engagement. I like this. So a lot of getting more skills, learning more tools, building your network. So I'm going to let this go for just a little bit longer. Meet the community. Great. So a lot of you are here for the similar reasons and the same sort of reasons for why we brought this kind of conference to Canada in the first place, right? Helping you to develop your tips in science or develop your skills in science communication, right? You guys are here to learn how to be better science communicators. You already have a set of skills. You're here to refine them as well as learn new skills and meet people doing the same thing. And so far, your workshop facilitators today have maybe introduced you to new types of science communication. And my job for today, or my goal today, is not to necessarily give you more skills per se, but is to rather show you how a person might take these skills that you're gaining today, these different types of science communication you're learning about, and how they might weave them together to kind of create their own space within the science communication community. And of course, the way that I've done this is by no means the right way, but it is a possible way. And along the way, I'm going to try to share some of the lessons that, I have learned retrospectively, but maybe wished I had known when I had gotten started in this field. So last question before I kind of get into my journey into science communication. I'm curious, what has made some of you get into SciComm? Why do you want to communicate science? Why do you want to be here to enhance your science communication skills? Combines a lot of my interests. Connection. That's an interesting one. I like that. I want to get people excited about science, to show people that anyone can be a scientist. Love it. Teach my family and friends about science. We got the personal connections. Stop the spread of fake news. That is no small feat. That's a big one. We need better representation in science because you like it. To help inspire these are some really noble reasons to want to get into science communication. To learn how to talk to kids. Oh, so people have been contacted for media, want to get those skills, learn how to do those interviews well. Too many myths floating around. I love it. These are all great reasons to get into, for why people might want to get into science communication. All right. So I'm sensing like a lot of passion to promote public understanding of science. Some folks care about research, want to be able to talk about their research better. Now I have a confession. I started as a science communicator over a decade ago at the age of 17. I definitely didn't refer to myself as a science communicator when I started. And I'll confess that my reason for getting into science communication, they were not quite as noble as, wanting to promote public understanding of science or inspiring people and showing them that they could be scientists too and that science was for everyone. I started being a science communicator because I wanted to have a really cool and a really dope summer job. I just wanted to be paid to have fun. Like I said, not the most kind of noble reason. But we're going to go back to the fall of 2009. And in 2009, I began working at the Ontario Science Centre. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is Canada's largest science and technology museum, famous for the big silver ball that makes your hair stand up. And in fall of 2009, I actually arrived at the Ontario Science Centre to go to school. Okay, so I had to go back into I had to reactivate my Facebook account and go way back on my profile to find this photo, which is from high school. In case you can't tell, this is me up here in the corner. Okay, so the Ontario Science Centre has a school for grade 12 students, and every year they invite 60 different students from across the country to do one of their semesters, from across Ontario to do one of their grade 12 semesters at the Science Centre. And as part of going to school there, they also ask you to volunteer in the center. And so in fall of 2009, I was doing high school at the Science Centre, and then they asked a bunch of us to apply to be student hosts. And so at Christmas 2009, I started working at the Science Centre as a student host. I then worked March break. I worked the summer before university, and in the fall of 2010, in the fall of 2010, I started as a full host. And so in 2010, I was going to university, I was doing my undergraduate degree in science, and on my weekends and one weekday, I was working at the Science Centre. Now, being a host is a bit of an unusual position. So if you've never been to the Science Centre, I'm going to kind of give you a rundown of what the hosts and who the hosts are. So we are the people at the Science Centre who wear the white lab coats. So we are the Science Centre's in-resident scientists. So we hang out in exhibit halls to do really simple things like help people find their way around the building. It's a big, confusing building. We give workshops and presentations. So, some days I would start off in our area for children 8 and under, doing workshops for children under the age of 3, and then I would have to switch to doing a planetarium show for a mostly adult audience. So there was a huge diversity of activities I did as a host at the Science Centre. And, hosts, as I spent more and more time hosting, and as I learned our exhibits better and kind of showed that I could present a lot of different types of science to different types of people, they started to give me more responsibility at the Science Centre. So, we would have these traveling exhibits that would come in, and we would have these media previews before these exhibits open to the public. And so I did a couple of these media previews speaking about what was going to be featured in the exhibits, but also kind of fielding all the interview questions from reporters and TVs and camera crews. When the Science Centre turned 50, I had the honor of getting to speak to a donors gala along with CEO Maurice Bertrand, Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, and Raymond Moriyama, who is the architect of the Science Centre. And as hosts, we were frequently sent off-site to different places to represent the Science Centre, kind of be that face of the museum. And so sometimes this meant doing TV hits for, a CTV. Sometimes it meant being on the radio. Sometimes I would do off-sites at places like Yonge Dundas Square, just trying to get people excited about science and bring them in the door. And I think one of my favorite off-site things that I did is I filmed an episode of TVO Kids Science Max. I will not show you the episode today. All I will say is you can find it on the internet. It is somewhat embarrassing, but if you go all the way to the end, it's really cool. I ride a giant top. I almost fall off and die. The director said it was the most dangerous episode of kids TV that he'd ever filmed. All right. So working at the Science Center for me was an amazing experience. I met so many great people. Our visitors gave me so much. And I had this chance to work with some really other talented and passionate communicators, many of whom you have already met. So Sarah, I know, led your workshop this morning. I had the opportunity to work with Sarah for a number of years. There's also Jesse Rogerson, who went from the Science Center to the Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa and now is a professor at York University. There's Katie Puella, who I believe is an attendee at this conference today. I worked alongside her, and Rachel Ward-Maxwell, who you will meet tomorrow. She's running a workshop for you with Vishnu, who's another one of my former coworkers. So I got to work with a lot of amazing people, but being at the Science Center also taught me some valuable lessons that I apply to everything that I do today. So this is kind of like my first lesson learned from my science communication journey, which is that good science communication doesn't just happen. It takes practice, and it takes a lot of practice. I have been doing what I do for over 10 years, and I will tell you that the way I communicated at the beginning is not how I communicated now. So I encourage you, as you know, you're kind of trying to find your own space to know that this will take time and practice, and that sometimes you have to be prepared to get outside of your comfort zone, right? You know, at the Science Center, you know, I was doing this undergrad in biology. I love talking about our nature exhibits, but I couldn't just talk about nature. I also had to learn to do things like talk about space and astrophysics and electricity. And so I often had to step outside of my comfort zone to learn how to communicate other facts and other areas. But, you know, that really helped me to develop my skills in communication. The other thing that I would really encourage you to do is you're trying and trying and trying again. You know, sometimes that's not going to go well. That's okay. That's part of the process. But also, if you have the opportunity to get feedback on how you're communicating, it's something I highly recommend doing. So at the Science Center, I was lucky. I kind of had bosses or program developers who would sit on in my shows, give me feedback, tell me if my analogies were working or not. But, you know, if you're giving a talk, if you have a friend or a more experienced communicator, you know, invite them to come along and then ask them for feedback, or even ask your audience for feedback when you're done. And most importantly, you know, there are the things that we're comfortable with. You know, maybe you really like science writing, or maybe you're kind of working on building your social media channel around science communication. I encourage you to, you know, try new things. Trying new things will help strengthen your skills. And while you're in that process of trying new things and doing something a little different, don't be afraid to say you don't know. And I think that's one of the most important things I learned at the Science Center is there's so much information out there that it's very easy for someone to ask you a question that you don't know the answer to. And it's totally okay to say to them that, you know what, I don't know, but why don't we go learn and find out together? The other really important lesson that working at the Science Center taught me was that you really need to know your audience. And if you take nothing else away from this talk today, make this the only thing, okay? Good science communication happens when you know who you're talking to. So one of the things that I hear a lot is, you know, I talk to the general public, or I write for a general public audience. Sometimes I slip and I say that, but the thing is there is no general public. Every time we communicate, we are communicating with a specific group of people. So whatever you do, whether it's writing or, you know, being on social media, always ask yourself, who is my audience? Who am I trying to communicate? And be specific as possible. You know, saying, I want to write a kid's book is not specific enough, but saying, I want to write a children's nonfiction book for children 8 to 12, that is a specific audience. And once you have a specific audience, then you can really develop that communication activity, right? You have to ask yourself, what do they already know? What beliefs do they hold, and what do they value, and what is the goal of my communication? And once you figure out who your audience is, maybe make some guesses about what you think they might already know and what you think they might value, you can use that audience and goal to inform the way that you're going to deliver your message. All right. So I'd encourage you, you know, if you know, what I just described at the Science Center is something that appeals to you, find an environment where you're constantly iterating and thinking on your feet and having to be good working at a lot of different types, or working with a lot of different types of audiences in different areas. You know, I encourage you to apply to a place like the Science Center, apply to work at the ROM, find a local nature center that's focused on hands-on activities where you've got lots of different people coming in and out. So I worked at the Science Center from 2009 to 2019. That's 10 years. But halfway through that period, something changed, okay? In 2014, I started my PhD at the University of Toronto working on what I would argue is the best animal in the entire world, bats. We can discuss why that is later if you'd like. And so I was going to grad school, still working at the Science Center on my weekends. And more, I was finding that the visitors coming to the Science Center started to ask me things like, well, you work here, but are you a real scientist? Whatever that means. But do you do your own science? And they wanted to know about what I studied, and they liked hearing me talk about bats and my work. And I was also starting to realize that I loved talking about what I was doing. I liked talking about my research. People were interested, and I was excited to share. So I kind of made this transition from just wanting to have a really cool summer job to wanting to tell people about all the cool things that I was doing for a living. But I wanted to do that some way outside the walls of the Science Center, and I wasn't really sure where to start. I was a grad student in a department that was focused heavily on academics. I wanted to do science communication outside of my job at the Science Center, and I didn't know what to do, so I did what any grad student wanting to start science communication, not really knowing where to start, does. I made a science Twitter. Okay, and I specifically made that my science Twitter the first summer of my PhD because I was doing field work in Toronto's Hyde Park. So I was in a large city park, I was catching bats, I was interacting with the public. They were coming up and being like, hey, can I watch you do your work? And then they were asking questions like, where can I go to find updates on your project? So I was like, well, Twitter. And so I would, diligently document what we were doing in the field. I took lots of pictures, videos. I would do like little explainers. I would introduce people to the bats that we caught because we would name some of the ones that we radio tagged just to, have a little bit of fun in the field. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but I would go on the internet and read about how other people were using science Twitter. And then I tried to find other people who were like me, other wildlife biologists who were using Twitter as a way to talk about their science and talk about their fieldwork. I said throughout this talk I was going to introduce you to Canadian communicators. I won't lie, there's only one Canadian on the slide, Jessie, who's now the chair of Indigenous Environmental Science at the University of Guelph. But Naima, Tyus, and Chris are all other great examples, people who I think you should follow on Twitter if you do the Twitter thing. They're great examples of people who work in the field while communicating their science. Okay, so not only was I starting to network and get to meet other people like me who were halfway across the country and who would later turn into my collaborators, but some of my tweets actually started to gain some traction. And one tweet in particular gained a lot of traction. So one of the things that I did early on is I sat and I Googled what sort of hashtags do wildlife biologists tweeting about their science use. And one of these hashtags that came up was something called Fieldwork Fail. And scientists from all over the world were using, this hashtag to share some of their most hilarious moments in the field. And so I decided to share this kind of experience that I had where I spent 3 hours on a really hot summer day tracking what I thought was a bat, but actually turned out to just be the crosswalks because the safety assist cross button operates at the same frequency as some of our radio tags. So I shared this on Twitter, and at the same time, there was this French illustrator by the name of Jean Jourdain, and he is not a scientist, but he was really interested in these fieldwork fails. He had read some of them in a French newspaper. He thought they were hilarious, so he decided that he wanted to start drawing them. Someone retweeted mine and said, Jim, hey, I think you should illustrate this one, like you haven't done bats yet, and he decided to do that. So he and I were chatting about this, and I said, Jim, I love your drawings. I think they're great, but before you tweet out this drawing, can we provide a little bit more context for people? Can we tell them about, why was I tracking bats in the city in the first place? Can we tell them a little bit about why we study animals in urban environments? And he thought that was great. And so we did kind of a science illustrated tweet thread before he released this kind of final fieldwork fails tweet. And then he started doing them with other scientists. And then, some of the other scientists and I, as we saw how the media were picking up these illustrations. We're like, Jim, this is really great. We're reaching a specific audience kind of on social media, often other scientists, but I think this has the potential to do a little bit more. So have you ever thought about putting all these together in a book? And he was kind of like, no, like that's crazy. Like, I don't want to do that. But we pushed and we pushed and we pushed. And a couple years ago, we were actually successfully able to crowdfund Fieldwork Fail, the messy side of science. So a bunch of those tweets are now published in a book. Jim has illustrated them beautifully. All of the scientists, myself included, get to write little explainers about, what we were doing and kind of the science behind the fail. And so this was a really great experience. And this wasn't something that I ever envisioned when I first created my science Twitter. I didn't say, I want science Twitter to end up in a kid's book. Like, that's not why I made it. But I think it really speaks to the importance of having a digital presence. So social media is not for everyone, and that's totally okay. But as a minimum, if you want to be a science communicator, you want people to be able to find you, have some sort of digital presence. Create a website, create a social media account, and use that to promote your work. And make sure you're updating your portfolio frequently. Every time you give another talk or you do another event, do not look at my website. It is a terrible example of this. Since I switched to industry, I haven't had time to give it the overhaul it needs. But if you're looking to build out your portfolio to do that, you got to make sure you're taking lots of photos and videos to document the things you're doing. And if you're ever giving a talk or you're doing an activity in a classroom, bring someone along and ask them to take pictures for you of you doing your thing, because those are going to be really important for building out your portfolio. And remember, if you have a digital presence, it means that people can find you, which means that they can hire you and they can ask you to sit on panels and they can do all sorts of great things. And if you're looking for a really good example of people who do this well, Samantha Yamin, Science Sam, she has a fantastic website where she's very diligently documented everything that she does. This is what she does for a living. It's a great, great example. There's also Eugenia Addy. She is the CEO and founder of Visions of Science, which is a community-based science program here in Toronto. The Visions of Science website is obviously, it's her company, it's a professional website, but I just think it's a really great example of kind of this well-documented portfolio of what her company does. All right, so I'm doing field work. I'm still working at the Science Center, and I'm tweeting about my work, and people see me tweeting about my work, and then they're like, hey, we really like your tweets. Would you come give us a talk? Come give a talk for us about bats. And so I started also doing talks. I was leading bat walks in the park. And in particular, while I was doing my field work in Hyde Park, I also paired up with the Hyde Park Nature Center. So the Hyde Park Nature Center had this great community science program where they would lend out these handheld bat detectors to people. People could take these bat detectors anywhere where they wanted, and they would collect data on bats in their neighborhood. They would also run these series of bat walks late at night, and they were a fantastic program that I loved assisting with. But one of the things I realized working with the Nature Center is, most of their audience was very small, children or people or families with children. But this particular program was really good at catering to adults. It wasn't reaching the younger audience like they wanted to. And so to kind of fill that gap or fill that niche, I actually worked with them to develop a children's component to their citizen or community science program. It was called the Junior Bat Biologist program. And as part of this program, kids would show up at the Nature Center. They would collect, they would have to do a whole bunch of different tasks that got them outside and exploring their neighborhood. And one of the tasks that they would do is they would show up and they would have a Meet the Scientist session. And so as part of Meet the Scientist sessions, I would hang out in the front lawn of the Nature Center with a couple of their other educators, and they would pull out a bunch of the big pieces of equipment that we would use to study bats in the park. And then I would let kids just see and explore, and we would talk about all of that equipment. So you can see in the background of this photo, I actually have a mist net set up over here. Right, in this photo, I had a stuffed bat by the name of Bartok, and the kids are using a reader to scan for a microchip that I had put into Bartok, and microchips are the way that we tell wild animals apart in the field, right? And for me, I love these experiences because rather than kind of focusing on the endpoints of knowledge that is like, what do we know about bats? It was more of a, how do we as scientists study bats? And this was something that was new to a lot of these children and a lot of their parents as well. And I want to, pause again to share another story about this little lady here. In case you don't know, or in case you can't tell, she is dressed up as a bat. And she showed up to meet me, not because she wanted to meet me, but because she loved bats and she just really wanted to meet a scientist who studied them. And she showed up dressed to meet me as a bat. And unfortunately, I leaned over to talk to her and introduce myself, and she started crying. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is not what I want. Like, I want people to have a positive experience. And she started crying because the wings to her costume were broken and she had to leave them at home. And she was worried that I, as a bat biologist, wouldn't know that she was actually a bat because the wings to her costume were missing, right? It's just like an adorably cute story, and her mom has reached out to me on social media a couple of times, and this is something that, 3 years on, this kid is still talking about. And the reason that I'm telling you the story is, one, she was adorably cute, but it's to kind of, that experience highlights for me that, sometimes what we do as science communicators is not about the science, right? As science communicators, we are facilitating experiences around science. And sometimes what's going to be more important is how you make people feel in the interaction. That is going to be far more important than anything that they learn from you. And, thinking about this, kind of prioritizing, not always, but sometimes how the audience feels in that experience, knowing that it's also okay to know that sometimes it's all right to step back and let your audience direct the experience. And I say this because so many times I have shown up with an activity plan and I know exactly how everything is going to go. I've done my homework on my audience. I know who I'm talking to. And, the kids or the parents or whoever it is I'm talking to get fixated on this other thing that I didn't think was interesting. And so sometimes you have to pivot and you have to go with your audience and focus in and help them explore that thing that they are passionate about and that they care about. And so then throughout my PhD, I kept doing these talks. I started doing media and radio TVs about my own work, so not just for the Science Center. That's a photo of me and my dad with a newspaper article that he was particularly excited about. I started doing science activities in the streets, so things like soapbox science I did 2 years ago. And as I was doing more and more of these activities, different opportunities, things that I didn't know existed just kept popping up, and I just kept jumping on them and meeting cool people who then introduced me to other cool people who were like, hey, do you want to try this other sort of thing? And so one of these cool people that I met in the process of all of this was Jesse Hildebrandt. Now, Jesse and I had actually done our undergrads together, and then we hadn't talked for a very long time. And then he went off and founded this thing called Science Literacy Week. Some of you may have heard of it. And so Jesse and I reconnected in the science communication community, and he very quickly became my biggest hype man. I never thought I would be in a position in my life where I could say that I have a hype man, but I do, and it is Jesse. He's very well connected, and a lot of my best opportunities have come because of him. And I'm telling you this because, again, and I know you've already learned this today, but I cannot emphasize it enough, network, and network some more. Okay, some of your best science communication opportunities are probably going to be unplanned, okay? But other people in your network will bring you cool things that you can learn from. Networking is just also a really great way to expose yourself to the diversity of strategies that people use for science communication in our community. And so thinking about, great opportunities and people bringing you unexpected things that may advance your science communication career, Jesse came to me, this one time. He's like, hey, have you heard about this thing called the Story Collider? And I was like, no, what's that? And so he sends me to this website. He's like, listen to some stories. And I'm listening to them. I'm like, okay, Jesse, but what is the idea? And he's like, I want to bring this to Canada. We've never had a Story Collider event in Canada. I want to bring it here. And I'm like, okay, that's great. What do you need me to do? Do you need me to help organize? What would you like? And he's like, no, I want you to speak. And I was like, I don't know about this one, Jesse. It was kind of like one of the first times where I was like, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I have a story to tell. And I don't think I'm going to be able to do it well and do the event justice. But Jesse was very persistent. He was very insistent that he thought I did have interesting stories about science. And so I decided to do it. One of the things I really like about the Story Collider is they actually, for those of you who are not familiar with the event, you actually will send in your story and they will work with you to make it a good story, to make sure that when you get up on stage, you are prepared to share a well-defined story. So I wasn't too sure about it, definitely out of my comfort zone. I was very stressed. I didn't feel like I could take it on, but I was like, okay, fine, Jesse, I'll do it. And I did it. And actually, it's turned out that this has been, I think, one of the best things I could have done. And I'm going to explain why in a little bit. But for me, it kind of is this nice reminder, and it highlights the fact that, as a science communicator, you're going to get a lot of unexpected things that come your way. And especially as you're new, even when you're not comfortable with something or you don't think it kind of really fits into what you do, take advantage of the opportunities that you can early on. And remember, exposing yourself to those different opportunities is going to help you as well. But, you know, that could quickly get out of hand. There can be lots of things and lots of requests that you may get. Also, I would encourage you to pause and think about how a particular opportunity will benefit you as a science communicator and help you develop into the type of communicator you want to be, right? And I will say that a lot of the things that I've told you about so far are things that I did for free. And I want to be very careful here to not encourage you to take on a lot of things for free that can be draining, that can be hard, and not everybody is in a position to do that. And even though you may not feel like it, I really want to highlight that, you know, science communication is work. Okay, it's not just a passion project. You should be paid for work, right? If you find yourself in a position where people are coming to you, they're asking you to do things, don't be afraid to sometimes ask to be paid. And this is something I think we need to do a lot better in the science communication, right? We can't just expect people to constantly be working for free. And, you know, but it's a hard line to balance. You're like, I want to develop experience. I care about these things. I do want to volunteer. So, you know, I kind of like to use this 3P rule. And this is not my rule. This is a rule that I got from Sam, that Sam got from somebody else. Anytime I get an event request or I'm thinking about doing a new project, I kind of put it in this passion, payment, prestige framework. So if I have a request for an event, I'm like, okay, is this something that I'm really passionate about? Is this an organization who is advancing something that I care deeply about, I think is really important? If so, I will do it, no problem. And then there's the payment, right? You know, some places don't have a lot of money, but they are organizations that I'm passionate about and I care about. So in that case, I'm like, yeah, I'll do this for, you know, a rate that is not market, or I will do this for free. But if someone like RBC comes to me and they're like, hey, we're thinking about doing this event around science, I'll be like, oh, okay, well, you can pay up, and you can pay up big time because you a bank, right? So you kind of got to frame each experience a little bit differently. And the last one is prestige, right? Think about what an event or a program or something is going to do for you as a science communicator. Is it going to advance your portfolio? Is it going to grow your network? Is it going to connect you to different people, right? These are all things to consider. You know, speaking of jumping on opportunities, I am really, really glad that I jumped on that Story Collider opportunity, or rather, Jesse pushed me to jump on it, because, you know, my story ended up on the Story Collider podcast. It was actually voted as one of the editor's favorite from that year, which was a really exciting thing to have happen. But since then, it's been a really strong and central piece in my portfolio. And it is the reason that Claire Caldwell actually met me. So Claire is an editor at Annick Press. So she works at a children's publishing house. And she sends me this email. She's like, hey, I listened to your Story Collider podcast. You know, Jesse sent it to me. And like, you're a science storyteller and I want to talk to you. And I was kind of like, I'm a science storyteller? Okay, Claire. And so Claire asked me to go for coffee. And she explains that, you know, Annick is looking for children's nonfiction books, but she wants that they specifically wanted those books to be written by science and to blend science with storytelling. And she's like, we don't really know what we're looking for. We don't even know what topic we want these books to be about, but do you have any ideas? Do you want to pitch us some stories? And I was like, well, okay, I guess if I can tell stories, I can tell one story. Maybe I can tell some more stories and layer in some science there. And so I pitched to Claire this idea of a book all about urban ecology, so studying nature in cities. But instead of that children's book kind of being the endpoints of knowledge, so what we know about nature in cities, I instead wanted it to focus on the people who were doing that work, the open questions they were still trying to answer, and I wanted to introduce children to this by layering in stories of these people working in the field. Claire and the rest of the Annick team really love this idea of kind of showing children the human side behind science. And I'm really excited to say that Adventures of Your Friendly Neighborhood Urban Ecologists will be published in fall of 2021. It cannot come fast enough. And other exciting updates about this, the manuscript is done. And we also have just officially picked an illustrator, Cornelia Lee, who is another amazing visual communicator also a member of the Canadian science communication community, so highly recommend checking her out as well. So I've talked for a while now. We're going to break this up with another question. So I'm kind of curious, what type of science communication do y'all currently do? I've kind of broken this up into big topics, but I'm always curious where people start. Okay, so it looks like we've got a lot of science writing. Public talks, hands-on outreach activities, maybe with organizations like Let's Talk Science, social media. Do we have any like visual? I'm curious, do we have any visual artists? Maybe people who are doing cartoons? Okay. Some folks. Awesome. All right. So this is what you currently do now. Maybe this is how you got your start in the field. We have a slightly different question. Is there another mode of science communication that you really want to try or that you really, really want to break into? Like visual communication, someone's ready. They're like, we've got some folks who want to start writing. So it's really great. It wasn't really until my kids' book that I started doing writing around science. So that was kind of something very new for me. Folks want to get into lots of folks want to get into visual communications. I love it. That's so great. I'm curious if the folks who've typed in other, if you want to drop that. Ooh, science playwriting. I never even thought about it. That's fantastic. I was going to say drop them in the chat. You guys are already on top of that. All right. So I encourage you, the reason that I asked you that, to think about what you do now versus what you might want to try in the future, is because I just spent a whole bunch of time showing you kind of all the different things that I tried along the way. So, I encourage you to dump on those different opportunities. They're going to help you to develop your skills, but also don't just let the opportunities come to you. Actively go out and look for them. If you know you want to write science, start pitching stories to places like The Conversation, right? If you want to give a Story Collider talk, find an event, pitch a story. Like that is something that can be done. If you want to do a talk in a bar for adults, find a nerd night organizer, ask them if you can go and give your talk. All right. So I encourage you to try as many different opportunities as you possibly can. Now, kind of the next big milestone for me in my science communication journey happened in 2019. So 2019 was the year that I left the Science Center, but it was also the year that I was invited to come down to, 2018 was the year I was invited to come down to ComSciCon in the States. So someone sent me this application. They're like, hey, you do science communication. Here's this like science communication conference that's happening in Boston and they're paying for students to come. And I was like, I want to go to Boston and meet some other science communicators. So that year was the first year that this American conference had opened it up to Canadians. And so I decided to go down, and as part of this conference, I actually gave a poster on my work with the Junior Bat Biologist program. And one of the things that I learned researching this poster is something that I really wish I had known at the beginning of my PhD, because I think it might have fundamentally changed my thesis. I might have actually put my outreach activities in my thesis. But that is that science communication is a field of research, okay? There are evidence-based best practices, and this is a body of knowledge that I encourage you guys to review and to think about. Now, it's a big body of knowledge. It's dense and it's depth. But if you ever kind of wonder, like, I have this strategy and I know it works, spend a little time researching why it works, right? You guys are all grad students. You know how to do literature reviews. Dive into some of that literature. And the reason that I'm encouraging you to think about evidence-based best practices is because sometimes if we don't communicate science well, or we don't communicate certain topics well, we can actually do more damage to our audience, especially around controversial issues like climate change and vaccines. So sometimes thinking about these best practices and how to best engage with certain audiences can be really powerful for helping you share your message. And if this is something that you really love, you're like, I want more, I want to like do the research that contributes to this body of knowledge, I consider formalizing some of your experience with a degree or a certificate. And two of the places that you can do that, Laurentian has a Master's of Science Communication program. It's run by Dr. Chantal Berriot. And I'm really excited. It's not official. it hasn't officially started yet, but McMaster University is also launching the country's second Masters of Science Communication. Dr. Katie Mosey is a professor there, and she is helping to get that program up and running and underway. The other really great thing for me about attending ComSciCon is I got introduced to a lot of other graduate students who were like me, who are fantastic communicators trying to balance research, but also this other field of science communication. Two who I really, really think that you should follow if you don't already is Alexandra Gill, who's of Pint of Science, and Rakib Tassayef, who she just does so many things. She's a complete badass, and I am in awe of her all the time. She's founder of Black and Neuro Week, founder of Broad Science, and is now a columnist. She talks on the radio about science for CBC. And so folks like Rakib, Alex, and I, we were all at this first iteration or first invitation of Canadians to ComSciCon. We left this experience feeling incredibly motivated and inspired, and we were like, this is great. Why doesn't Canada have something like this? Like, why do our graduate students not have access to this? And so we came back from that meeting in 2018. And the following year, we decided to launch ComSciCon here in Canada. And so in 2019, we had our first national meeting. 2020, this year, we had our second national meeting, and we also kind of poked and prodded and asked other folks if they would help organize regional meetings. All of you guys are here today at ComSciCon-GTA because of the hard work of your organizing team, and that is an extension of bringing ComSciCon here to Canada. And so I'm really excited to continue to see this kind of organization grow and promote and help other graduate students develop their science communication skills. All right. The other fun thing I loved about, organizing ComSciCon is it really helped me dive even deeper into the science communication community. We were trying to fill panels and organize workshops, and I just met so many cool people who I would love to sit and tell you all about today. Two of my favorite people who I chatted with at the conference, some of whom I had known before, are Amber Sandy, who's the coordinator of Indigenous Knowledge and Science Outreach at Ryerson University. She's organized some fantastic programming with Ryerson, and also Hilding Nielsen, who is a member of the Dunlap Institute here. Both fantastic communicators who I highly recommend following and getting to know. But organizing ComSciCon didn't just, introduce me to more cool people in the Canadian science communication community. It also taught me, I think, two really important lessons. And the first is the importance of not replicating efforts. So initially, when we were looking for money to fund the national meeting, I was going to universities, to organizations, and I was like, hey, we have this really great idea, but we need money to make it happen. Can you support us? And we were getting turned away a lot because people said that we were replicating effort. Long story short, turns out we weren't. We had to write some detailed proposals highlighting how we differed from all the other activities out there. But I think it speaks to the importance of, if you have a really great idea, highly encourage you, get out there and pursue it, but do a little research first, right? Try to figure out how this idea for a new initiative or a new program or a kid's book or a science article that you have, how does it fill a niche in the community, right? And if you find that there's somebody out there who's already done what you've done or already doing it, I'm not saying that you should stop, but instead perhaps find a way to collaborate with others. And kind of in that vein of collaboration, one of the things that we were working on for our 2020 national meeting is actually merging ComSciCon with the Canadian Association for Science Centers meeting. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have that meeting in person, but moving forward, I'm really looking forward to help integrate ComSciCon into the broader Canadian science communication community, which has until this point kind of been separated and disjointed, but is starting to come together. The other really great thing that I think ComSciCon continues to remind me of is the importance of evaluating impacts. So a lot of the times we develop these activities, we give these talks, and we're like, we are promoting public understanding of science. But how do you know the activity that you've developed is having the effect that you intend, right? I think this is something that all science communicators can get a little bit better about, is thinking about how we actually start to assess the impacts of our science communication. And in that vein, we are really interested in how these sorts of training opportunities benefit graduate students in the long term. So we have actually successfully applied for and received a SSHRC grant to measure the long-term impacts of this training. right? And so if you're developing a program or you're doing some sort of initiative and you think it has some sort of outcome, the first step is to always be really intentional about what you're trying to communicate from the start. But then I'd also encourage you to collect some data to maybe see if that activity you've developed is having the intended effect. And if you're not sure how to do that, you're not sure where to start, there are so many amazing social scientists out there who are trained in these things and may actually want to make your activity part of their research program and work with you to help assess those impacts. All right, so in 2019, for me, it was kind of the year where it stopped so much for me being about me doing science communication and switched more into me helping other people to build their science communication capacity. This is a role that I really enjoy. In addition to ComSciCon, I'm also doing a lot of workshops in science communication. I am teaching in science communication here and there, and I've also started consulting for companies as they are developing things like textbooks and nature-based programs and activities. So again, definitely not something that I ever thought I would be doing, over 10 years ago when I started in this field. And that brings us to today. So at the very beginning of all of this, I talked about finding your niche in the science communication community. And to be honest, I'm over 10 years in, and I don't think I've quite found my space yet. And after 10 years of doing this, I think a lot of folks are surprised that I don't do this full-time for a living. And that's partially because as I've gone through these different experiences, I've tried different things, I've learned, what types of communication I'm good at and what types I'm really, really not. I've learned something important about myself, and that's that I don't actually consider myself to be a science communicator, right? And in fact, all of the learnings that I've shared with you today, these aren't just things that'll help you be a better science communicator. These are things that will help you just be a better communicator flat out. And when you can communicate well, you can do anything you want. And so just remember, if you ever have a professor or another grad student or anyone in the academic community who's giving you a hard time, telling you that science communication is a waste of time, they're wrong, because you are developing your communication skills, and those communication skills are incredibly valuable to a lot of different employers. So thinking about my niche and the type of science communication that I do now and want to continue doing, I'm a communicator who tells stories, right? I think that is the niche that I have made for myself. At work, I'm telling stories about data, about how we can use data to build a better customer experience. For my book, I'm telling the stories of people who haven't really been well represented in science up until this point. Okay, but I don't just tell stories about science or stories about data. I tell deliberate stories that call my audience to action, right? So at work, I tell stories about data that try to change the way we do things for our company and our business. With my book, I'm telling stories about science to encourage kids to feel empowered and have stewardship and want to explore the nature in their cities. With ComSciCon, here the call to action is getting universities to realize that graduate students deserve communications training because it will help them do their science better and it will help them get jobs in the future. And it's about helping professional science communication organizations realize that the work all of you are already doing as graduate students outside of formalized institution benefits this field as a whole. And so my final question for you guys today is not one that you'll weigh in digitally for, but it's one that I want you to take away and think about. It's not something that I thought about when I started in this, but it's, what do you want your niche to be? Okay. As you're starting on your journey or as you're continuing on your science communication journey, ask yourself, what type of communicator do you want to be in the future? What do you want the impact of your work to be? And then from there, try different things and realize that as you try and do different things, that niche that you kind of ideally want may change and shift a little bit. Now, there is no right way to do this, and I can't help you find your own niche, but I'm hoping that some of what I've shared today will eventually help you to realize and find that space on your own in this community. I know I've talked for quite a while, but I'm more than happy to take any questions at this point if anyone has them.
Cylita, thank you so much for that talk. That was incredible. I don't know if you can see the chat, but there's like a ton of emojis coming in and praise from people. So Thank you so much. We do have some questions, so I will go ahead with those. The first question is, can you tell us about how to pre-order your book? Do you have any details on that yet?
So I don't, and it's funny. I did my first book reading, and that was also the first question. Unfortunately not. We are still working through illustrations, but as soon as we can pre-order it, you will hear about it on Twitter. You will hear about it on Twitter repeatedly, so please, that's a great way to stay up to date.
So stay tuned, everyone.
Stay tuned.
We have another question here. How do departments to fund science communication training? It sounds like teacher training is funding a lot, but not necessarily science communication training.
Yeah. I wish that I had a good answer for you on that. And so this is one of the things that we're kind of starting to dig into is we're thinking about assessing the impacts of science or ComSciCon. It is showing folks that, folks who engage in communications training, it's more likely to help students find employment afterwards. There is some data on this from the ComSciCon side in the States. And so I don't have a good example. I don't have a good answer, but anytime that I ask for money, I usually try to get the support of graduate students. Or other people that I'm planning the event for. And I have shown my department, I have shown other departments that there is a desire for this training, that it's not just me saying like, I want to run this training, but rather is actually saying how many graduate students and postdocs would attend this training. So that's one of the things you can do is collect data to support your case, whether that's data in the literature about how this benefits students in the long term, or whether that's data about your department and wanting the desire for this and collecting those kind of anecdotal pieces of evidence for why students think that they would benefit from it.
Thanks. Another question here. Do SciComm courses also teach visual communication? If not, do you have any suggestions on where we can learn that sort of thing?
So there are visual communicator programs. So full disclosure, I am not formally trained I haven't gone through one of these programs. I don't know what Chantal covers, and I don't know what the new Masters of Science Communication at McMaster will cover. But I believe there's a visual communication program. It's for scientific illustration at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Another great person that you can follow to kind of learn more about visual communications and kind of getting into that field, her name is Julia, I believe, Krolik, K-R-O-L-I-K, I think. She's a visual communicator. She runs a visual communication society. Their website might have more information about where you can go to get formal training opportunities in that area. Thank you, Farah. You're always in the chats with the important information.
Yeah, so check that out in the chat if you didn't see it. This is a fun question. What is your favorite species of bat that you've worked with, and of any species, and why?
Ooh, okay, so unfortunately, I'm a field biologist. I've worked with bats, but I've only ever worked with North American species. I mean, they're fine, they're cute, they're adorable, but like there aren't that many of them, and the ones in the tropics are way wilder. Favorite species I've actually handled is the hoary bat. It's about the size of your palm. It's Canada's biggest species. I know, not that big. They're just really cool because we didn't catch them a lot in the field, so catching them was like a very rare experience. They're much larger than the species I work with, which is like about the size of my palm. And they actually click the finger bones in their wings, and they hiss at you to say, hey, let me go. So they were always fun. My favorite, I guess, species that I have never worked with, but is just like one of my favorites. I think it switches based on the day and how I'm feeling. But I think today it's the bumblebee bat. It's called the bumblebee bat because it's the size of your thumb. It's in competition for being one of the world's smallest mammals. So they're pretty, a bat that is the size of your thumbnail full grown is pretty darn cute. Right?
It was super exciting for me to hear because when I was a kid, I was obsessed with bats. I don't know if anyone's read the book Stella Luna, but I loved that book when I was a kid, and so I was super into bats. So
we were talking about my bookshelf earlier. I actually have Stella Luna on the book.
Yeah. So another question here. how do I get my colleagues interested in communicating their work clearly to peers, scientists in other fields, and non-experts? And this person said that they do math, but they're interested in other fields too.
Yeah. So that's a hard one, right? You're trying to persuade people to take an action that they may not necessarily see the value in the action. And so those are like encouraging people to communicate is one thing, and encouraging them to communicate to different types of audience, I think, requires specific and different types of motivation. So if you want to get your colleagues to talk more about their science kind of in plain or maybe simpler language than they currently do, or maybe talk about it for science Twitter, which is other scientists, you can show them literature on the fact that when people tweet about things or when papers are more understandable, people cite them more because they get them, right? Tweeting about your work isn't a waste of time. We've seen time and time again that people who tweet about their science get cited more. So that is showing perhaps your colleagues that this does provide them with some sort of direct benefit to their academic career. Now, encouraging people to talk to, I guess, let's say like non-technical or non-specialist audiences outside of what they do, that one is a little bit harder. I think that requires, a case-by-case approach. Not everyone is comfortable doing it, but it might be interesting asking your colleagues what their reservations are, what their hesitations are, and kind of going from there. If they're worried about not having the skills, recommend there are a bunch of online trainings you can do. Maybe you can work with them to kind of help refine their message, or encourage them to try it and let them know that they do have those skills. If it's a case where they don't think it's valuable, maybe share some of your own anecdotes about how you found a lot of enjoyment in this and how your audiences have clearly benefited from you doing your communication. Persuasion is hard. There's a whole body of literature on doing it and doing it well and having good rhetoric. So it's case by case.
Thanks. And we have time for one more question. The question was, I'm interested in how to publish a children's book. Can you provide any expertise? Would you recommend getting an agent? Any tips you might have?
Yeah, so publishing is an entirely new experience for me, and it wasn't something that I set out to do. And so I think my biggest piece of advice, so I don't have an agent, I work independently. More and more as I'm, I've started a new job full-time. I've been working there for 5 months. I'm finding it harder and harder to balance these things. So more and more I'm wishing that I had an agent to kind of just help and do all that groundwork of the pitching and the managing and all that other stuff. But I think, before you get ahead of yourself, the best place to start is coming back to that, doing your research and doing that due diligence. So if you have a really good idea, figure out if it exists currently. And if it doesn't exist currently, then you have you're in this cool place where you can start pitching that to publishers. So it might involve looking at different children's publishing houses, seeing what types of works they predominantly publish, what audiences they cater to, right? A kid's book is not just for all children, right? You have toddlers, you have children 6 to 8, you have 8 to 10, you have 10 to 14. There are different age groups. So really figuring out what your niche is. And once you figure out what your niche is, you can figure out what publisher maybe aligns with that niche, and then you can start pitching to them. If anyone is really interested in pitching, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm a little slow to answer these days, but I'm more than happy to help if I can.
So much, Cylita. Unfortunately, we're out of time right now, but I just want to say again, thank you for that excellent talk. It was super inspiring, and you can definitely see from the chat, everyone agrees and everyone really loved it. So thank you so much for joining us. We're really lucky to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me, and please, all of you, go make your digital presence known. If it's not on Twitter, that's fine, but make a website. Do it. Do it now.
All right, so I'm going to pass it off now to Nathaniel and Sarah again.